No need to get a tie, right? Natasha.
That last sip of coffee.
I like that coffee mug. I like that.
Yeah, kind of
yes.
neat.
Yes.
Hey, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our summer speaker series. Great to have you all here again. I'm Tasha Davenport, CEO of CASBO, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Bob Canavan. He's the principal of federal management strategies in DC. He is also our federal lobbyist that works really closely with Sarah Baches, who's also with me today, Chief Government Relations Officer here at CASBO. And so really looking forward to this conversation. Bob, it seems a decade ago that we were in DC with you and Sarah and our leadership team at CASBO, really talking about the need for support, funding as California had those unique situations of the wildfires, and here we are, right back with all of it. But that seems a long time ago, and I really appreciate you joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
A couple of logistics as we get going. As you know, we've got the PowerPoint, as you might know by now. We've got the PowerPoint and conversation in the Q&A box there for you. We are recording the session. And Sarah will introduce you to all kinds of resources at the end. We continue to update those. And so that's sort of those logistics. We'll be taking a question answer towards the latter part of the webinar today. Sarah's moderating that conversation. And again, turning it over to Bob here in a minute. But before we do, I really have to share with you that I feel like we are, like, you're the host of a watch party for us there in DC for the version of House of Cards. We've got stalled negotiations and people not talking to each other. We've got president executive orders. We have money being borrowed from one fund to support another. It is like watching House of Cards. So thank you for taking us there and sharing with us what's going on that we need to know about right now. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Are you ready for me to start? I'll start right in. First of all, I do want to say, it's interesting you say House of Cards, and the cards are really being shuffled back here right now. But before I get into that, I really do want to make a comment. You mentioned that the last time you were in DC, you were dealing with wildfires, and it's ironic that you are right now today. Additional wildfires, just as school districts are working to reopen schools, it's compounding it even more. The heat wave that you're dealing with right now. So our topic is to talk about whether or not there's going to be additional funding coming from the federal government to deal with COVID, to deal with the reopening of schools. And as we move into it, I just want to review for just very quickly that Congress did pass the CARES Act, which is now Public Law 116-127. And under the CARES Act, there should be about $1.4 billion in emergency funding going to local education agencies in California right now. Now that was passed in March, and that funding should be going to school districts now. It should be in the hands of the districts for utilization. Now, it was distributed on the basis of Title I formula. There's a good degree of flexibility allowed to give the school districts the opportunity to use it for purposes that they need to. It's not just for Title I, it's for what the school district might need to use for preparing for reopening of schools and also to deal with COVID. It's $1.4 billion. That's not enough. That's not what you need. So the question is, will there be additional funding? Well, in May, the House of Representatives passed the HEROES Act. And the HEROES Act in May was about a $3 trillion piece of legislation, which included additional funding for education, approximately $70 billion for K-12 education. Now, obviously, there was additional funding for higher education as well, and substantial funding for state and local governments, and additional provisions for payroll protection, aid for hospitals, and a substantial amount of money. But the idea was to help state and local governments deal with the lost revenue that they will have as a result of the epidemic, but also to help school districts deal with that as well. Now, note that I said that passed in May. Well, between May and June, everyone was waiting for the Senate to take some kind of action. It took until July for the Senate to actually put together a bill, which is called the HEALS Act. And the HEALS Act was put together by the Republican leadership in the Senate without any input from Senate Democrats. The HEALS Act included approximately $105 billion for education. Approximately $70 billion of that was for K-12 education, but I do need to note, as that was to be distributed based on the input from the administration, 2/3 of that was to be conditional on students actually being on site, physically present in schools. So 1/3 of the money that was in this HEALS Act in the Senate was to go, 1/3 was to go directly to K-12 schools. 2/3 of it was going to be distributed proportionally based on the number of students that were actually physically in the classrooms. At the same time, there was a set aside for private schools based on the number of students that were proportionately within the school districts in private schools. If we could go to the next slide, please, we'll continue this conversation. What happened with that Senate bill was the Senate never voted on it. There was no vote taken in the Senate. And as it sat there at the end of July, moving very close to the congressional recess, negotiations began between the administration, Secretary of the Treasury, and the White House Chief of Staff, who were negotiating directly with House Speaker Pelosi and with Senate Minority Leader Schumer to try to come to some sort of an agreement over this. But interestingly enough, the Senate Republican leadership did not participate in those negotiations at all. And those negotiations continued for a while, but the two sides were very, very far apart. And I would editorially say one of the reasons for that was that Speaker Pelosi and Secretary of Treasury the Secretary of the Treasury had worked very well together on other packages, but the presence of Mark Andrews, the White House Chief of Staff, I think caused a lot of difficulty in these particular negotiations. He had been a member of the House of Representatives. He was the chair of a very conservative caucus within the House, and everything that he got involved in the House led to some serious difficulties. He caused problems for Speaker Boehner, Republican Speaker Boehner, when he was the Speaker of the House. He caused problems for Speaker Ryan when he was the Republican Speaker of the House. And his presence, I think, in those negotiations caused a great deal of difficulty. The net result was the administration was saying, our packages, our number is $1 trillion. Democrats want $3 trillion. We're not going to come to an agreement. In the meantime, Republican leader McConnell was not engaged from the Senate perspective, and they came to the end of July and the pending congressional August recess, and there was no agreement. So when they left town for the recess, they left town with no agreement, and the issues that were still outstanding potentially were funding for education, funding for state and local governments, because the administration and Republican leadership in the Senate were saying they did not want to fund state and local governments, And a big one was funding for the Postal Service. So that's where things left. Now, what was left on the table? Many things were left on the table, including funding for education, funding for SNAP, and funding for child nutrition. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So there we were. No agreement as Congress left town. The president and the White House said, well, we can take action by ourselves to deal with some of these issues. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not the president actually had the authority to do what he said he would do through these executive orders. But nevertheless, the administration said, well, watch us. We're going to do what we can through executive orders. And so the president issued a number of executive orders, partially extending unemployment benefits. Now, what they said they were going to do was extend unemployment benefits. If you recall, there was discussion of $600 per week to people receiving unemployment benefits. Well, the administration said, we'll make that $400 a week, and states will have to pay $100 of those $400 a week. And to pay for that, since there was the president has no authority, Congress actually provides funding for programs such as this. The president has no direct authority to do it. In the executive order, they said, what we will do is we will pay for this by using disaster assistance funding from Homeland Security and from FEMA. So these unemployment benefits that are being extended right now, many states are uncertain whether or not they're actually going to utilize it, but it's actually going to be at most $300 and for a limited period of time because the funding is really going to run out. And at the same time, it's going to put tremendous pressure on FEMA and disaster assistance programs. And look at what's happening right now in your state with these additional wildfires. So as California now has the dilemma of dealing with these wildfires and the potential of seeking additional disaster assistance for that, you're probably going to hear the administration say, we don't have any money for it. Where'd it go? It went to these pay for this executive order unemployment benefits that the president did just recently. Other things that are included, postponement of payments under student loans, suspending of payroll taxes. You've probably seen there's a significant amount of controversy over that because it's temporary and potentially both the employer and the employee is going to be liable for those suspended payroll taxes potentially next year. And there's a significant question about whether or not the administration did have the authority to do this because this really is a congressional prerogative. And last thing in the executive orders was delaying evictions, but actually they did not do it. They really did say what we will do is recommend to HHS and HUD that HUD recommend to landlords that evictions be delayed. So there was no direct action taken. So these were the executive orders that the president issued, and each and every one of them is going to be challenged legally. And that is the action that the administration has taken, but it does not really resolve the issues that were being addressed in the HEROES Act and even in the HILS Act that was being proposed in the Senate. So where are we? We're still very much in the situation where these stalled negotiations have to continue. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Well, where are we? Well, it's the August recess. Congress is theoretically home. They're not on vacation. They should be, but where we are right now for these 2 weeks, this week is the Democratic convention. Next week is the Republican convention. So normally when the political parties are having their conventions, there's no congressional action, and it was not intended that there would be any congressional action these 2 weeks. And then Congress would be out for virtually all of August and come back in September. But in the meantime, we've got the pressing need to put more money on the table to school districts, to state and local governments, and to address all these issues that we were talking about. So Congressional Democrats led by Speaker Pelosi and Mr. Schumer do want to resume the negotiations for the unemployment benefits, payroll protection, reopen schools. They want funding for childcare as well. They want funding for nutrition programs, hospitals, state and local governments. And actually this week, Speaker Pelosi is bringing the House of Representatives back into session, which is unprecedented actually, to take up a bill at the end of this week and to vote on a bill at the end of this week to provide additional funding for the Postal Service. Now, I'm sure everyone has seen on the news the controversy that has been created by the administration and by the Postmaster General in cutting back services at the Postal Service. So the House is going to be providing in this legislation an additional $25 billion for the Postal Service to provide immediate assistance and also to assist with assurances that states will be able to deal with mail-in balloting if states were providing mail-in balloting, and to ensure that the election would be appropriately handled, and balloting. The post office would be able to deliver mail, and ballots would be treated as first-class mail and not delayed in its delivery. So that's something the House is doing. Now, unexpectedly, the Senate has just said that, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to do something too. So Senate Majority Leader McConnell announced yesterday that the Senate is now going to draft another bill, a smaller version of their HEALS Act, in which they're going to try to do something for the post office. So obviously all the political pressure that's been generated over the last 10 days over the Postal Service is creating some pressure on both the administration and Republicans in the Senate to say that we have to address that issue. And at the same time, I think the majority leader of the Senate said we have to get back into the game on the COVID package as well. So one thing that seems to be potentially in this package is that they will have that funding for education that they had in their original bill. So from our perspective as education folks, it's good to see that the Republicans recognize that schools have to be funded. Additionally, COVID aid needs to continue to be part of the package. So in some kind of a package this year. Don't worry, I'll get to how is this going to end up, but I'm just trying to build it up to a great closing here. So now we see the House is coming in this week to vote on a bill for the Postal Service. The Senate is saying, we want to get back in the game. We're going to write another bill for many of these issues that were in our original HEALS bill. The real issue is money. How much is going to be on the table? Because the original House bill, HEROES Act, total figure was $3 trillion. The Senate bill was $1 trillion. The Speaker Pelosi said, well, normal negotiations. We're at $3 trillion, you're at $1 trillion. Let's split the difference, come to an agreement on the number of $2 trillion, and then we'll work out the details. Well, the administration had been saying all along that they only wanted $1 trillion. They still seem to be very negative on state and local government funding, but obviously they're coming around on postal service funding. So there still is hope that they will come around on funding for state and local governments. The only question is at what level, and will they actually, one, will they do it, and critically, what will the number be? So this leads us up to September, because the likelihood of them actually, let me just pause a little bit. With the Senate rewriting their bill, and with the House now doing this postal bill, what we hope will happen that the talks will resume now in August. Informal talks between the Speaker and the administration, and perhaps Senator McConnell will join these talks as well during this month of August, so that when Congress returns in September, the negotiations can resume for real. And if they can resume for real, both the House and Senate will be there and be able to vote on additional COVID aid package. One other thing I do want to mention to you to make this even more complicated, because, you know, I don't want things to be simple. I don't want you to give you an easy formula. In September, all of the appropriation bills for normal appropriations for the next fiscal year have to be enacted. The next fiscal year, FY21, begins on October 1st. So there's a distinct possibility, given that none of them have passed. The House has passed all their appropriation bills. The Senate has passed none. There's a very real possibility there could be what they call a continuing resolution at the end of September. The continuing resolution is always a massive bill where they put all these appropriation bills together. So it's always a big bill with major negotiations over that. It's possible that we could see the COVID aid package and the CR end up being one massive bill at the end of September. We don't know that's the case, but one thing that is critical, it is critical and imperative that the COVID aid negotiations resume as soon as possible, and that education funding be in there, and that schools, state, and local government funding be included in the COVID aid package. And if it is combined with a continuing resolution in September, that would be great. But the most important thing is whether it's a freestanding bill, whether it's in the CR or not, it's critical that additional funding be included. Certainly at the level that the House and Senate were both saying for K-12 education, which would be approximately $70 billion. One of the things I think advocates in DC education community would be talking about would be try to push back on that provision that the administrations be talking about, which is 2/3 of it should be allocated towards with a requirement in effect, even though they didn't say it that way, but in effect it was a requirement that students have to be in school. Obviously, it's becoming more and more apparent that you know, there's in some way you're having a hybrid system, maybe partially in school a few days a week and otherwise remote learning. Sarah and I were talking before with the rolling electrical brownouts that you may be having. You'll be having difficulty with that. So it's another difficulty that you do have. If we could, so that's where we are as we move towards August and September. The COVID aid negotiations have to continue. Schools have to be included in it. And I just want to summarize a couple of the bills that have been out there very, very quickly, and I'll stop for questions. Can we go to the last slide? So here we have the CARES Act, $1.4 billion in emergency relief aid is going to LEAs right now. The HEROES Act, which passed May 15th, had approximately $70 billion for elementary and secondary education. The Senate bill, which was never even voted on, had $70 billion as well, but as I said, 1/3 was to be released immediately, 2/3 reserved for schools, partially open for in-person education. It did have that, what I call a set-aside for private schools, but we now see that that's being revised in the Senate. We hope negotiations will be conducted later this month into September to come to some kind of agreement on the big picture funding for the package. And the thing we would like to see is the number hold for the amount of money that would be going to K-12 schools. Again, it would likely be distributed based on Title I formula. One of the last items to point out is that on terms of funding for state and local governments, the reason why that's important, your California budget partially is, I think the governor, when he came out with the cuts that he proposed for education, his expectation was there would be additional funding coming from the federal government. And if that funding did come, those cuts would not have to happen. So it's critical that this additional funding come. So in the legislation, the CARES Act had $150 billion for state and local governments. The HEROES Act proposes $915 billion for state and local governments. The Senate HEALS Act proposed zero. So somewhere in this last package, there's got to be something in there for state and local governments as well. So that's an overview of where everything is, and I'll pause for any questions, and hope this was helpful. Thank you.
And so at this time, we let folks know that they're more than welcome to use the Q&A box or raise your hand through the icon feature to speak. Just a few questions, given that how you tied it back to California. Our budget is predicated on $14 billion being materialized at the federal level before October 1st. Should that not happen, deferrals will trigger. And for K through 12, we have about $11 billion in deferrals for our overall education funding. Have there been any discussions, one, on making sure that we, even though discussions break down, we're still in August, we have a looming October 1st timeframe. So as they come back, even if they did some patchwork to hold us over, what's the feeling in terms of, is education a priority? It's seen in all these actions, both on the Republican and Democratic side, there is appropriation for education. And then, so I'll begin with that, given that that really is one of the biggest heartburns in California, is our budget is dependent on new federal funds.
Well, that's why I tied it in somewhat to that continuing resolution discussion in September. Because the federal government's going to have that budget issue itself with its own budget. So I am hopeful that they will be able to wrap up this this package before October 1st. And if it's included with, I'm not hopeful. I mean, they should wrap it up before October 1st. If it's tied into the CR, that may make it even better. That means the money will be committed. Well, let me put it this way. The money will be in the pipeline by then. So if they pass it in the same context as the continuing resolution and get it done by October 1st, you will know how much will be coming. I can't tell you what the dollar number will be, but certainly that will be the intention, to try to get it done by October 1st. Will it be allocated? Obviously, it will start flowing to the states in October and then to locals after that. So there have to be a little negotiation. I mean, if the governor sees it is coming, that's where negotiations will take place. But certainly the goal will be to try to get this done in September by October 1st, because that'll accommodate both the new federal fiscal year coming up and at the same time give consideration to the pressure on that your state's experience and other states too.
Has there been any discussion to expand the use of CARES Act beyond the December 30th, 2020 deadline? Because since the state gave us $5.3 billion to as resources from the coronavirus, and then we got other federal funds to bridge our budget, many of them come with a restricted short-term time frame to expend, not to encumber, but to actually spend down by December 30th. Are there any discussions to also extend current CARES Act dollars beyond the 30th deadline?
I think that's very possible. I think there'll be a recognition that as that deadline comes up, that the funds have not been fully utilized, that can be addressed. But they've not said we're going to do a CARES 2. But I think that we'll take a look at it, certainly. And we will raise it with people for sure.
And on that, how can school business officials get involved given that there is a quick time frame? Congress is coming back, having hearings and deliberations. What are recommendations that we could give folks as they're building their advocacy packages, sending out materials to their local congressional members here in their district offices? We know we have great leaders in California that are in the House, that there are their leadership in Congress. So how can we activate them so that they're aware of what's taking place?
I think the best way to do it is talk very directly, if possible, with your local congressperson and their staff people. I've mentioned this in when I've been talking to your groups. There are district offices, district office staff people. Let them know what your needs are. Also, let them know how you've used the funding that has come in, what it's been used for, and what additional needs there are, and what complications there are, so that when they go back to Washington, they can say, well, this is working well, but we still need to make some changes. And then they can convey that to the chairs of the committees and to the leadership. You have a tremendous advantage in that the Speaker of the House, who is carrying the ball on so much of this, is from your state. Also, the minority leader of the House, Mr. McCarthy, is from your state. So you've got, that's unique. That truly is unique. It's conceivable that the next vice president of the United States may be from California. And Senator Harris and Senator Feinstein have been very supportive. But I really do say, let your member of Congress know what is happening and what the issues are and what else you think can be done to make things work more easily for your schools and for your students. And don't feel you have to talk, you can only talk to the congressperson directly. Their staff people are very responsive, and every congressperson has at least 1 or 2 offices in their district. And they have people who they want to hear from you. They do want to hear from you, particularly in an election year.
On that, Congressmember McCarty has been very receptive to conversations we've been having on liability protection. We're trying to work with the legislature in California, and the Senate Republican plan has a component on limited liability. Are there any further conversations or discussions that we can engage in, that schools can let folks in Congress know how important liability protection is in this COVID-19 environment? Have you heard any further conversations on that topic?
Well, I do know in this smaller bill that they're putting together in the Senate that the liability protection for a number of institutions, including schools, is included in the Senate bill, the second Senate bill. So that's important. You know that the provision that's in the HEALS Act it's gotten enough attention that as they even make that bill smaller, that provision is also included in there as well. That is a provision that is important. Senator McConnell has made that point. Of course, he was not involved in the negotiations. You may want to make a point with Democratic members in the House that this is an important issue as well, because I think you've got support on the Republican side. It would be good to reinforce it with Democratic members as well, that it's important for school districts.
Have you heard, or are there any other additional updates on the child nutrition side? As we closed down in March, there were many waivers that were approved, in order to allow for the use of the seamless option program for child nutrition programs? Are there discussions taking place as we continue to do distance learning in how to provide child nutrition programs? Is that an area that we might need to continue pushing, do you think, or it's an area to now just focus on the funding side?
No, you definitely continue to be active on the waivers as well as the funding. And I did want to say that the House had provisions for additional funding for both SNAP and for child nutrition. The waiver issue, USDA has responded on the waivers, but I know there's significant concern that the waivers have to continue beyond December of this year and into next year. And that needs to you have to continue pushing on that one as well. USDA, I think, feels they don't have the total authority to extend it unilaterally. So there's legislation to try to do that. And there are some very good sponsors in the House of Representatives on the Democratic side who are working on that legislation. But no, you absolutely need to keep pushing on that as well, because it's and when you talk about the distance learning side, that complicates delivery of child nutrition as well as the whole issue of student fees on child nutrition. That is a big issue, and that waiver needs to be extended longer term.
And then moving on to distance learning, now it feels like a lifetime ago, Tasha and a group of executives were part of a call with the Federal Communications Commission Chairman, Pai, to explain the need to build out our internet infrastructure and capabilities, given that we're in this distance learning environment. Are there any new discussions? I know that the Congressional and the Senate Democrats plan did have add-ons for infrastructure for connectivity. The Senate Republicans plan did not have an appropriation to expand that area. How can we help in communicating the need, especially in areas where people might not know that we have white zones, that just connectivity is difficult to get because of the region, the area, the location, and we haven't built those out. And then the power outages aren't helping us here. So who else do you think on that topic is critical to engage on connectivity and internet structure?
That is one of the issues on the Democratic side, on the HEROES bill, that the Democrats do want. They will continue to push for it. And you are right. There's been a lot of talk on the part of the administration about they've done a lot recently for rural hospitals, for example. But they've not engaged on this. They feel that USDA has done a fair amount in this area, that you just need to keep banging away on that issue. There are more hot spots or areas across the state. People don't understand. They just think, oh, it's automatic. It is far from automatic. And it's getting more and more complicated, as we just said. With these power outages that are occurring, it's becoming even more difficult. So I would urge you to continue to highlight that issue with the members. When you talk to them, say this is an issue, and even though it may not be an issue in your particular district, there are other districts in California where it's a serious issue. And from a united perspective, we should let all members of the delegation know that it's a critical issue in California.
Are there any discussions in terms of additional, as we're thinking of unemployment and with how it's affecting housing issues, that affects our families and communities. So what other areas that we might not know necessarily affecting us, that we might need to be aware that those are areas that are being advocated loud and clear. I think sometimes we get in a space where we only focus on education issues, but are there any other areas that are really drumming up support that we need to be aware of that might be competing interests for the positive, but might be competing interests that are getting a lot of attention in DC right now?
Well, it's interesting you put it that way. We might say we could call them allied interests. Housing, there certainly is a significant concern about housing. And in many cases, when they put together a list of issues that need to be addressed, many times education and housing are combined. Not that they're in the same agencies, or not that they're directly related, but it's almost like we need to take care of education and we need to take care of housing. It's never presented as either or, but the issue, it always becomes a difficult issue when they get to the point where we have X amount of money. Then how do we start allocating the money? And that's where the negotiations become extremely difficult. But housing is, they have some very strong advocates, I can tell you that, just like there are some very strong advocates in the nutrition community as well. But I think the groups get along very, very well in terms of recognizing mutual needs, let's put it that way.
And a fun one.
Okay.
Any update with the USDE? Any update on guidance on how school districts are to distribute funding for non-public schools, so private, religious, or institutions that had been distributed under the CARES Act? We had then seen new guidance from USDE through Secretary DeVos. Then there was huge pushback, and so we're still waiting on clarity from DC on how can we appropriate those fundings for non-public schools?
Well, I kind of smart. There are a number of ways I can answer that question. I could certainly say, let's wait till January and see if there's some changes, but that's too far down the road. The HEROES Act has language in it that limits some of the approaches that the Secretary is taking in terms of pushing hard for distribution of funding towards private schools. It still remains to be seen whether or not that language would actually make its way into the final COVID legislation. We do know that the Secretary is going to try to steer as much of it as she can, but there really has been some strong pushback in a bipartisan way, even over in the Senate. So I think she's treading somewhat more carefully than she may have in the past. But I think, to be realistic, as the administration is moving towards, the election and towards the end of its, if it is the end of its time, we may see the Secretary try to see how far she can go. But there are people on the Hill who are watching it very, very carefully. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some appropriation language that may appear, at least from the House of Representatives, that will try to limit that.
And on IDEA,
Yes.
any discussions on, we're seeing a wave of litigation arising from families not feeling served, having students that are not being assessed or feeling like they're getting the necessary and adequate educational services. It's something that's always on our mind as we are trying to devise plans to serve these communities and our students. Any updates on discussion for serving special education students or any advocacy on the special education side of restrictions that they would want to see in order to ensure services are rendered to their students?
I haven't seen anything directly in terms of restrictions, but one of the things that is recognized, and this is something Senator Patty Murray has done, who's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Help Committee, and also the ranking Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Committee dealing with education. She has a bill in the Senate, which Senator Schumer is using as a major part of what he's been advocating for. which would call for an additional $17 billion for IDEA and $12 billion in this COVID aid package. And this is something Speaker Pelosi is supporting as well. So one of the approaches that the Democrats are taking in these negotiations is specific funding for IDEA to put more money in the pipeline for IDEA. That is the approach that they're trying to take, recognizing that there may be unique needs now that have to be met. But the approach they would like to do is to put additional funding to help school districts provide those services. But I haven't seen anything in terms of litigation that would be moving in the direction of saying there needs to be more restrictions on school districts. I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean it's not out there, but I haven't seen specific legislation to that extent.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. With that, we haven't seen any additional questions on the queue and no raised hands at this time. I know that things are in flux, and that was a lot of information despite the ups and downs of what DC is.
Well, no one dozed off.
So we have resources attached to our PowerPoint presentation for our viewers. We update this as often as we see changes taking place. Anytime that Bob sends CASBO updates, we will release news breaks. This really is something that we're monitoring on a daily basis because of the interactions it has with our resources and our state funding. If people have additional questions moving forward, please feel free to contact Tasha or myself. And Bob, thank you so much for being available today. Thank you so much for presenting with us and being a partner in DC.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to work with you and with your members. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Tasha.